All right, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to get started. So hello everyone and welcome to this media briefing during which we're going to launch the 11th annual edition of UNEP's flagship emissions gap report. All right, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to get started. So hello everyone and welcome to this. Sorry, I sort of paused because there was an echo. I'll just start again. Welcome to this media briefing during which we'll launch the 11th annual edition of UNEP's flagship emissions gap report. My name is Keisha Rukikaire and I head UNEP's news and media unit. I will be moderating the event. As I mentioned, this is an annual report each year. The emissions gap report analyzes the gap between what we've pledged to do and what we need to do to keep global warming well under 2 degrees Celsius and pursue 1.5 degrees as agreed to in the Paris Agreement. This year's edition is quite timely, coming just ahead of the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. It's also particularly useful in terms of the fact that it takes into account the impact of the pandemic and how our actions following the onset of the pandemic can affect global emissions going forward. Just before we get into the subject matter, I just want to go through a few housekeeping guidelines. This program is 1 hour long, and we hope to use half that time for Q&A. We will start the program with a message from the UN Secretary General on this emissions gap report. Immediately after that, we'll have a short presentation of the report's main findings by the lead author, Anne Olof, which will be followed by brief remarks from our high-level panel, after which we'll move to questions. So today's panel is, as I mentioned, quite a prestigious one. We have Ms. Inga Anderson, Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme. We have Professor Petri Talas, Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. Mr. Owais Sarmad, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. Mr. Abdallah Moqsit, Secretary for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And finally, Mr. Archie Young, the UK's lead climate negotiator for COP26. For media with questions, you'll see a Q&A option on the screen before you. Please submit your questions in writing in this box. You can start right away to submit your questions, as many of you I know will have received the report under embargo already. Please make sure you specify your name and media house when you do put these questions in the box. For your information, the session is being recorded and is also being live streamed. The recording and the live stream can be accessed through our website, unep.org, as can the SG's video message and other materials pertaining to this report. My contact information is also available on the press release and on our website. Should you want to interview authors and experts, please get in touch. Without further ado, I think let's head straight into the Secretary General's message. I think we'll give the producer about 30 seconds or so to try and cue this video. Seconds or so to try and cue this video.
The COVID-19 pandemic has slowed the global economy. As a result, greenhouse gas emissions will briefly dip, but this slowdown will not save us from climate disruption. The Emissions Gap Report 2020 tells us that last year, total greenhouse gas emissions, which include land use change, reached a new high of 59.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. It also tells us that current commitments under the Paris Agreement still imply a global temperature rise of over 3 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels. This would spell catastrophe. But we have an opportunity. A sustainable pandemic recovery that prioritizes climate action can protect human health, jobs and economies, and limit global warming. We are seeing a growing number of encouraging pledges for carbon neutrality. Our objective for 2021 is to build a global coalition for net zero emissions. But we need to see these pledges turn into concrete plans backed with real action and investment well in advance of the next climate change conference. I expect that more countries will take these necessary steps at the upcoming Climate Ambition Summit. We need to put a price on carbon. We need renewable energy and green jobs, no more fossil fuel subsidies or new coal-fired power plants, more support for fossil fuel dependent countries to diversify their economies, and solutions that nurture and restore nature. I urge all nations, particularly the G20, to heed this call and protect people, prosperity, and the planet we depend on.
Great, thank you very much. I will immediately go to the presentation by Anne Olof, who is the head of climate policy and planning at the UNEP DTU partnership and the lead author of the emissions gap report, for the presentation of the main findings. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Keisha. I just need you to enable me to share my screen because it's disabled.
Okay, so someone on the back end is helping us with that.
Thank you.
Try again, please, Anne. Thanks.
Now it's working much better. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present the key findings of this 11th emissions gap report, which has been produced in a year where COVID-19 has taught all of us the true meaning of economic and social disruption. So usually the gap report is launched ahead of the UN climate change conference, but with the postponement of COP26 this year, it was decided to launch the 2020 report ahead of another important milestone, the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, which will be marked this Saturday by the Climate Ambition Summit, co-hosted by the United Nations, the UK, and France, in partnership with Chile and Italy. As in previous years, this report has been prepared by an international team assessing all the latest information available. This year, 51 leading experts from 35 institutions across 18 countries have contributed to the report. The report process has been guided by a steering committee. All the chapters have been extensively reviewed, and the countries specifically mentioned in the report were given a chance to comment on the findings in advance of its publication. As you can see on this slide, most of the questions of the report remain the same from year to year. So each year we provide an update of the trend in global greenhouse gas emissions. We look into whether countries are on track to meet their Cancun pledges for 2020 and their nationally determined contributions for 2030. And then we assess the gap between the global emissions resulting from the implementation of the current NDCs and the emissions levels that are consistent with the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. What's different this year is that we are including preliminary assessments of the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and related responses on GHG emissions out until 2030. We also look into 2 areas that are particularly important for bridging the emissions gap and that have become even more relevant in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these are international emissions from shipping and aviation, which are not covered under the NDCs. And then finally, we look at the role of behavioral change and of lifestyle changes in bridging the gap. So let's start by looking at global greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see for the 3rd year in a row, these rose in 2019 to a record high of 59.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. Over the last decade, they have risen around 1.5% on average per year, and they still show no signs of peaking. Now, as we already heard, and as it's clear, especially carbon dioxide emissions will experience a significant dip this year, which could be up to 7% in 2020 due to the COVID-19 lockdowns. On the figure, you can show the reduction in 2020 emissions relative to pre-COVID levels due to these lockdowns. And it's clear that the main dip is in transportation. It's also clear that for emissions from power, industry, and residential areas have been more or less comparable with pre-COVID levels since August this year. It suggests that when restrictions are lifted, maybe the transport emissions will also become gradually more comparable to pre-COVID levels. If we turn to the progress towards meeting the Cancun pledges for 2020, collectively the G20 members are projected to slightly overachieve these pledges. 7 individual members are projected to meet their Cancun pledges even without taking the effects of COVID-19 into account, If we also consider the effects of COVID-19, USA is also projected to meet its Cancun pledge. However, 3 individual G20 members are still unlikely to achieve their pledges. It's uncertain whether Indonesia will achieve its pledge, and the conclusion for Australia depends on whether we consider its point-in-time target for 2020 or its budget target. It's important to note that these pledges and the achievement of them, while being a positive and encouraging sign, that these are not sufficiently ambitious to really create a better platform, better starting point in 2020 for getting on track to the Paris Agreement goals by 2030. We then need to look at the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, where currently, as a group, the G20 members are not projected to meet those based on current policies. We have 9 individual G20 members that are projected to meet their unconditional NDC targets. There are 5 that will need additional policies or stricter enforcement of existing policies to meet their targets. And for 2 countries, it's still uncertain. The reason why we focus specifically on G20 members is that they account for about 78% of global emissions. One of the most positive developments this year is the growing number of countries that have committed to net zero emission goals by around the middle of this century. If achieved globally, this is in line with what is required for achieving the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. At the time we completed this report, 126 countries covering just over half of global emissions and including more than half of the G20 members have put in place net zero goals have put forward net zero goals. If in addition the USA also announces such a goal as indicated by the Biden-Harris plan, this share would increase to up to 63%. However, if these goals are to remain credible and feasible, they need to be backed up by concrete climate action now and significantly stronger NDC targets for 2030, as the following slides where we show the emissions gap will illustrate. So let's start by looking at what we can say is the 4 basic scenarios. So at the top of this figure, we have the 2010 policy scenarios. It's a reference scenario, and it basically tells us how would emissions develop out until 2030 if we hadn't put in place any additional climate policies since 2010. The next scenario then shows us how much emissions have been reduced given the policies that have been put in place since 2010. You can see the reduction is in the order of 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year by 2030. It's also clear, however, that there is a big difference between these scenarios and the pathways that are required for 2 and 1.5 degrees. The unconditional NDCs would further lower emissions compared to the current policy scenario by about 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And if in addition we also have the conditional NDCs implemented, global emissions would be further reduced by a further 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. However, this is still clearly insufficient to bridge the gap. In 2030, the gap is significant. It's between 12 and 15 gigatons of CO2 equivalent with respect to a 2-degree target, and it's between 29 and 32 gigatons of CO2 equivalent with respect to a 1.5 degree target. The size of this gap remains unchanged from last year. Put differently, we can see that the full implementation of the current NDC pledges will lower emissions compared to current policies by up to 9%, but what we need is basically reductions of more than 25 and more than 55% compared to current policies to get us on track to 1.5 and 2 degrees. You may wonder why the emissions gap hasn't changed this year, as some countries have indeed submitted new or updated NDCs, and also in light of the COVID pandemic. The reason why it hasn't changed is that although there have been new and updated NDCs, these have mostly been submitted by smaller emitters, and the overall effect on global emissions in 2030 is assessed to be less than 1%. The COVID-19 pandemic will likely affect current policies and emissions under current policies, and we'll return to that. But it has not yet affected the NDC targets and the NDC scenarios, which is why the emissions gap hasn't changed. Before we turn to the effects of COVID-19, let's just recap what the temperature implications of all of this is. So in line with previous reports, current NDCs will lead to a temperature increase of at least 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. We also looked into the possible effects of the newly announced net zero emissions goals and find that if fully implemented, these could further reduce global warming to around 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. If in addition, the US puts forward a net zero greenhouse gas emissions target by 2050, the global warming implications would be further lowered to around 2.5 to 2.6 degrees Celsius at the end of this century. It's important to note that we really need to put forward more ambitious action in this decade. Basically, if we postpone ambitious climate action any further, it will become impossible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Let's now turn to the effects of the COVID-19 crisis on global emissions and to assess the possible effects, noting that these are of course very uncertain still and that we're just doing exploratory projections here. But we basically looked at 4 what-if scenarios based on scenarios put forward by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and looked at the implications for global emissions. It's quite clear from these scenarios that future global greenhouse gas emissions depend critically on the extent to which the recovery considers a low carbon development. As we can see from these 4 explorative scenarios, the effects on global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 are in quite a huge range. They actually range from increasing emissions by 1 gigaton of CO2 to decreasing emissions by 15 gigatons of CO2 equivalents by 2030. These results show both the range, how important and critical it is to really focus on low carbon development as part of the economic recovery. And they also show us that if we do focus on a low carbon recovery, the effects could actually surpass the current NDCs and bring us on track to achieving a 2 degree goal by 2030. So, has the opening for using fiscal rescue and recovery measures to accelerate a low carbon development been utilized? The short answer is not really yet. We look into some of the major fiscal trackers of COVID-19 measures, which includes the IMF, Vivid Economics, Oxford University, and the Climate Action Tracker. And we find that so far the opening has largely been missed. And this is particularly important in light of the unprecedented scale of the spending on rescue and recovery measures, which at the end of December amounted to around 12% of global GDP when we only consider fiscal responses, and is much larger if in addition monetary responses are considered. It's notable that there are large variations across countries. And in continuation of that, it seems quite clear that it's much easier for countries that have already started a green transition to actually use the COVID-19 recovery packages to further strengthen this transition. I will just zoom in on a few of those countries that actually have shares of their recovery measures up to 3% of GDP that are dedicated towards low carbon measures. It's also clear so far that the bulk of these measures fall in the middle category of measures that are either climate neutral or where it's unclear what the effect on greenhouse gas emissions will be. So there is still a huge opportunity to influence the way that these packages are put together and to ensure that they become greener. Unless this opening is used, the Paris Agreement goals are likely to slip further out of reach. We'll then turn quickly to international emissions from shipping and aviation, and these are not covered by the NDCs. And furthermore, emissions from these sectors are not easy to abate. Based on current policies, these emissions could account for between 60 to 220% of permissible CO2 emissions by 2050 under 1.5 degree scenarios. It's therefore critically important to pursue different mitigation options for these sectors, and these include energy efficiency improvements. They include a rapid transition away from fossil fuels towards biofuels, synthetic kerosene, and hydrogen. Long-term alternatives such as electricity are harder to implement and would require changing the design of both ships and aircrafts. In all cases, fuel prices are likely to increase several-fold, and all of these changes need to be driven by stronger policies, and these need to be put in place very, very urgently. The final chapter of this year's report assesses the role of behavior and lifestyle changes in bridging the gap. Around 2/3 of global emissions can be linked to household activities when we use consumption-based emissions accounting. And as this figure illustrates, governments, citizens, and civil society all play key roles in shaping and making lifestyle changes feasible. 3 areas or sectors make up the largest contribution to personal emissions, and these are mobility, residential, and food areas, each of which contributes around 20% to personal emissions. There are a number of options to reduce emissions in these areas, and many of them will depend on the extent to which government legislation, regulation, and incentive structures facilitate such change. It's particularly striking to look at the inequality in the distribution of personal emissions across income groups. Globally, the top 1% of income earners emit more than twice the combined share of the poorest 50% of the global population. Around half of the consumption emissions of the global top 10 and 1% are associated with citizens of high-income countries, and most of the other half with citizens in middle-income countries. If we then turn to looking more into detail of the per capita lifestyle footprints, the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement would require per capita footprints of around 2 to 2.5 tons of CO2 equivalents by 2030. This would mean that the richest 1% would need to reduce their current emissions by at least a factor of 30. On the other hand, it also means that the bottom 50% income earners actually have room to increase their footprints by around 3 times compared to their current levels. Let me end not by repeating or trying to summarize the answers to the main questions. I put them here as sort of a cheat sheets, but I just want to highlight 3 main takeaways from this year's report. First, 5 years after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the emissions gap has not been diminished, it's not been reduced, and time is running out. Secondly, there is hope in the growing number of countries that have committed to net zero emissions goals around the middle of the century, but these need to be reflected in climate action now and in much stronger targets for 2030. And third and finally, the unprecedented size of the economic recovery spending offers an opening for addressing not only economic and social priorities, but also for accelerating a green and sustainable transition. If we want to keep the Paris Agreement temperature goal alive, we cannot afford to miss out on this opening. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anne. I will move swiftly to Ms. Inga Anderson, Executive Director of UNEP, who will make brief remarks.
Thank you very much, and to my colleagues also for being here today. So you've heard the primary messages from Anne. Essentially, the net zero club is rising, but we need to do much, much more to address the climate emergency. It's been 5 years since the world adopted the Paris Agreement, but as our emissions gap report shows, we've made insufficient progress on what we had hoped and still hope will be a game-changing global deal on the climate. We're already in trouble. Last year, we saw a new record high in greenhouse gas emissions. This year is on course to be one of the warmest on record. Storms and droughts are intensifying. Glaciers are melting more quickly. Even worse, we're still heading, as we just heard from Anne, for at least a 3 degrees centigrade temperature rise this century. This would bring pain, misery, and disruption that eclipses everything the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown at us. The pandemic-linked economic slowdown is not going to make a real difference. We can expect a drop of up to 7% in carbon dioxide emissions this year. This translates only to 0.01 degree reduction, i.e. meaningless, of global warming by 2050. But a green recovery post-2019 can get us back on track. This report finds that the green recovery could cut up to 25% off of emissions we would expect otherwise to see by 2030 if we continue with current policies. This could bring 2030 emissions roughly in line with the levels that give us a chance, a good chance, of reaching the 2-degree goals of the Paris Agreement. But more is needed to reach the 1.5-degree goal. The report lays out many ways to deliver emissions reductions, from the direct support for zero-emission technologies and infrastructure to backing nature-based solutions and policies that enable lower carbon consumptions. So far, only around 1/4 of G20 members have dedicated some spending to such measures. Unfortunately, most spending has backed the status quo. But this has to change because new stimulus packages are being discussed in G20 governments across the world. The growing number of countries now committing to net zero targets is encouraging, but they need to be urgently translated into strong near-term policies and actions and be reflected in the updated national determined contributions ahead of the next climate summit in Glasgow. By investing in a green recovery to get a head start, and by pushing on with systemic change planned and tracked through stronger NDCs, we could hit the 2-degree target, and we have a shot at the 1.5. In a few days, the UK government and the UN, together with others, will hold the Global Climate Ambition Summit. The leaders who attend are taking bold action on COVID-19, saving many lives, and bringing us closer to an exit from the pandemic. I call on them to take similar bold action on climate now, when the world needs it the most. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. Next, I'd like to ask Professor Petri Talas, Secretary General, to make a short statement.
First of all, I would like to thank UNEP and Inger for this great report, and it's of course very alarming report. The numbers are not very encouraging, and the fact that only European countries and the United States have been able to reduce their emissions during recent years, that's not very promising. From WMO's side, we are playing complementary role with the UNEP. We are showing what's happening in real atmosphere. And Inger was actually already referring to some of our findings that we have been publishing in recent weeks. We still see an increase in the main greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and that has been happening year by year. We have seen also an increase in the ocean heat content year by year, and in atmosphere we have depends on this El Niño La Niña variability, whether we will reach the all-time high this year. There's still a chance that this year will be the warmest, despite of fairly strong La Niña, which is cooling the atmosphere. We have seen a boost in the melting of glaciers, which means that we will get less water to the main rivers worldwide, and the sea level rise has been also boosting. We have seen higher numbers during recent years as compared to the past. This year, we have seen record-breaking forest fires hitting California and Colorado as examples, and we have seen devastating flooding in China and Vietnam. And we broke all-time high in the number of tropical storms hitting Caribbean countries and United States. We didn't see too many Category 4 and 5 hurricanes this year, but all together the number was highest ever. And here it's important that we stick to the essence, and the essence here is to concentrate on reduction of carbon dioxide emissions coming from consumption of oil, gas, and coal. So that's 2/3 of the problem, and since the lifetime of carbon dioxide is so long, that's the key issue. Methane has contributed 1/6 of the problem, and its lifetime is only 11 years. So basically, we could solve this problem in a more speedy manner. And there has been lots of attention to the carbon sinks, and this is about 10% of the problem altogether when it comes to carbon emissions. And we still see a continuation of the deforestation in Africa, in Southern Asia, and Latin America, which is not very encouraging. And recently, because of the strong warming in the Arctic, we have started seeing strong emissions coming from the forest fires in those regions. And finally, I would like to say that it's positive that the European Union, Japan, and South Korea have already indicated that they would like to become carbon neutral by 2050, and China by 2060. And we expect that US would join also this 2050 carbon neutrality club. But what matters finally is the real action. So this kind of political will is a positive thing, but what happens to the emissions and what happens in the real atmosphere, that's the key. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Just a reminder to media colleagues that you can send your questions into the Q&A box. We have a couple already, so that we can start to queue them up for the Q&A session. Our next speaker is Mr. Owais Sarmat, Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Mr. Sarmat, please go ahead.
And a great pleasure to see a number of colleagues who we work very closely with from UNFCCC, UN Climate Change here. And thank you very much for allowing us to share our perspective. To start with, on behalf of the whole of UN Secretariat of Climate Change and our Executive Secretary, Patricia, who couldn't be here today, I'd like to really thank and most sincerely UNEP for this absolutely critically important report that comes out just ahead of the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. As it does, it includes some very important messages, a few of which are encouraging, but most of which sound the alarm bells. We are not yet doing enough, as it clearly points out, and we are running out of time to address climate change. Not only does the report provide valuable information to parties and stakeholders about the gap between the current rates of emissions, taking into also account the impact of COVID-19 crisis and the pathways to be consistent with the goals of Paris Agreement. But it also provides excellent suggestions on how to narrow and close that gap. Ladies and gentlemen, on 12th December, in a few days' time, we will commemorate the 5th anniversary of Paris Agreement, which has been and continues to be a covenant of hope with the people of the world and one of the humanity's greatest multilateral achievements. Its goals remain very clear, but as the GAP report reminds us, we are not on track to reach its goals. Global emissions, as has been said by other presenters this morning, are increasing and leading us to almost a 3-degree rise in global average temperatures or even more. Recovery from the current pandemic offers everyone, particularly the nations, a great opportunity to build forward better, to reorient green policies and plans. Paris Agreement amazingly provides that path forward. Although COP26, as we all know, was postponed to next year due to the pandemic, the GAP report reminds us that we dare not lose momentum on climate action. COP26 should mark the beginning of a new phase in the multilateral climate change process, where ambition by all countries towards carbon neutrality by 2050 represents the only way to achieve a sustainable, healthy, equal and fair future for all. The ambition needed to be reflected now is first and foremost NDCs and net zero long-term strategies by 2050. Here, nations can specifically chart their path forward, both with respect to mitigation and adaptation. We have no time for delay. Long-term strategies provide a home for successive NDCs. NDCs are only submitted once every 5 years, in this case, by the end of this year. 5 years from now, our collective window of opportunity to address climate change will likely be closed. A balanced package of outcomes from the intergovernmental process, including on finance and support to developing countries. Action by all, including commitments from non-party stakeholders, businesses, cities, regions, NGOs, academia, and everyone else. COVID-19 in combination with climate emergency has exposed humanity's greatest vulnerabilities, as we have seen, and magnified its most urgent challenges. While there can be no silver linings in the human devastation, the convergence of these two crises offers a slim but an important window of global opportunity to build a better future. And I therefore urge all countries to seize this opportunity to use COP26 next year to demonstrate their ambition to addressing climate change and to showcase how they will build forward better. And in that regard, the UN's multilateral or interagency collaboration, as you see here today, is going to be extremely important, and we are very proud and very fortunate to be working with leaders that you've just heard, and we commit to continuing that collaboration, even strengthen it as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sarmad. Our second to last speaker is Mr. Abdallah Moqsit, Secretary for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Please go ahead with your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the organizer to invite me to take part in the launch of this very, very important report. It is a particular honor and pleasure for me to be sharing a platform with our parent organization, UNEP and WMO, the parent organization of IPCC, and also with our main customer, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. I'm really happy to be with them. And also with our the host of the next COP26, the UK government. And I want to take the opportunity to thank all of them because for their contribution to sustain the visibility of the IPCC. And I want also to take the opportunity to ask the UK government to continue to maintain for IPCC this tradition about having a pavilion in their country to show to a pavilion that could be sort of hub for climate change science, including all the information. I want also for the same reason to thank UK for the contributions for IPCC, an excellent contribution for technical support unit as well, the focal point. So the release of the annual emission gap report has become an important fixture for the climate community. This year is particularly timely. The IPCC is advancing work on our sixth assessment report, despite the challenges conducting scientific work during the COVID-19 pandemic. The literature cutoff date for Working Group 1 of IPCC, which is in charge of scientific basis for the sixth assessment report, is the end of the next month, on the 31 January. So it will be possible to include the finding for this gap report in the working group assessment if necessary, because this is a good opportunity to update the scientific information thanks to this report. The past report of the IPCC have established without doubt the fact that of dangerous climate change and set out its impact and potential risks. We have also laid out policy options for policymakers to consider. And with also this gap report, it is more information there to help. There is an even greater emphasis in IR6 on pollution, for more policy relevant regional information, to an understanding of demand side of climate change, motivation for behavior and decision making. Governments have responded to IPCC report with the Paris Agreement 5 years ago. And this month, we are celebrating the 5th anniversary, and IPCC will provide an introduction and assessment. But during this 5th anniversary, the information, scientific information, including the emission gap report, will be critical. The emission gap report provides an essential reality check for policymakers as well as a rich source for scientists assessing the policy responses. Let me finish by taking advantage of these distinguished audiences by reminding you that the review of the IPCC Working Group 2 in charge of impact and vulnerability that are currently underway, and the review of the Working Group 3, which is in charge of solution and mitigation, that will start next month. I very much hope that government represented here and many experts will contribute where their expertise and insight to enrich our report. At the end, of course, it is about taking decisions, because to advance, you should act. To act, you should have good decision. To have a good decision, the decision maker need good information. And with this emission gap report, beside the climate report from WMO, CO2 bulletin from WMO, and also all the reports from IPCC, we have the opportunity to have a sort of climate change science package, or we can say tweet case for decision makers and stakeholders that we can provide to any decision maker. And at the end, I like the last slide from Anne, when she summarized all the questions needed by a policymaker, head of state, prime minister. What they need something like this, where we have a sort of all the conclusion, key messages in one flyer, in the size of visit card. But I am hoping seriously, beside this tweet case tool for decision maker, to add key messages from emission gap report, key messages from climate, annual climate from WMO, and this bulletin to provide any decision maker something to have in his pocket to take a decision, trusting that behind this information, all the information is there to take action and to seek good future for this generation as well as future generation. Once again, thank you very much for this opportunity you offered me, and good luck for the anniversary for the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moxit. And our final speaker today is Mr. Archie Young, the UK's lead climate negotiator for COP26. Mr. Young, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to UNEP and the expert author team for yet another hard-hitting and rigorous analysis. It is so important for all of us to collectively have that clear and evidence-based understanding of where we are headed. And I won't repeat the findings of the report, which we've heard so clearly articulated today, but I'd highlight of course, the point it makes in terms of the reality and the severity of the challenge, the fact that emissions have still been rising, the fact that the 2030 emissions gap is as large as ever, and the fact that while emissions have temporarily fallen in 2020, it is for reasons that are not motivated by climate action and the expectation that they might rejoin their upward trajectory. And that gives us cause for a really severe look at what we are all doing, whether we're doing enough, whether we're going far enough, whether we're going fast enough. But I'd also point to the encouraging signs. The extremely encouraging developments in the form of new long-term net zero commitments from China, Japan, South Korea, in addition to the EU, and of course, the UK's own 2050 net zero target that we legislated for last year. And also encouraging new nationally determined contributions this year from many countries, including Jamaica, Rwanda, Chile, Colombia, Norway, Marshall Islands, and many more. And as the UK, we were very pleased last week to announce our new headline NDC target of an at least 68% reduction in emissions since 1990. But what everybody needs to do now is connect that long-term goal and the short-term commitments. We need new updated NDCs that are truly a progression on previous commitments, linked to and on a track towards robust net zero commitments, underpinned by long-term strategies and guided by the best available science. And on that last point, thank you, Abdullah. And we know from the work of the IPCC that early action is the lowest cost way to get there, the best for the climate. And Abdullah, we are very happy to continue to champion the work of the IPCC. Now, the GAP report shows us that the tragedy of COVID-19 has at least provided an opening. If recovery packages are organized to be truly green and sustainable, supporting greenhouse gas emission reductions, and also then going back to that previous point about consistency between short-term and long-term, also consistency about climate plans and recovery plans. And the report shows that we can go a long way to closing the gap. This is a huge opportunity. As incoming COP presidency, we are creating platforms for countries to seize those opportunities. So this Saturday, as has been mentioned, we are co-hosting, along with France and the UN, in partnership with Chile and Italy, the 2020 Climate Ambition Summit. 5th anniversary of the adoption of the Paris Agreement, we wanted to create a platform for countries to come forward with high ambition commitments under the Paris Agreement's 3 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, and support. Over the last 5 years, we have seen considerable movement in the real economy, but we wanted a moment to put countries in the spotlight. And we see the Emissions Gap Report as setting the scene for the Climate Ambition Summit. And the summit in turn will provide the context for what is needed in 2021 from all countries ahead of COP26. What do we expect? Well, we expect to see a whole range of new commitments brought forward covering mitigation, and that's both NDCs and long-term goals, as well as on finance and adaptation and resilience, particularly in the form of adaptation communications. We know that this alone won't close the gap, but we hope to see another significant step in the right direction. And we hope that in announcing our headline target last week, that can galvanize others to do the same. I'd also recall that when we were working through the postponement of COP26, regrettable and challenging as it was, the thing that we heard most consistently was that the postponement of COP26 could not mean the postponement of climate action. And when I reflect on just the last few weeks, we've had the Race to Zero dialogues organized by the high-level champions, the UNFCCC climate dialogues, and now we have the forthcoming Climate Ambition Summit. And I think what you see through those is an arc of transformational action, multilateral process, and political momentum. And I think you see the determination and the commitment of all of the members of this distinguished panel, but all of the people in the process to really make progress despite the challenging conditions. Now, the GAP report itself, we see as a very important contribution as well to the work of the UNFCCC. It helps us to review whether parties are on track to reaching the temperature goal through their existing commitments. It complements the UNFCCC's own aggregated synthesis report. And next year's reports will be especially important in defining how far we have closed the ambition gap. And we need to keep tracking it each year once those NDCs have been revised in full. And when we meet in Glasgow next year, we will need to look at that collective ambition and work out what it means for us all. But in the meantime, we continue to press for progress on national action, for progress on the UN climate negotiations, and through our 5 presidency campaigns to accelerate transformational change in key sectors. These are all complementary to give confidence despite the challenges, confidence to commit to further action, confidence to come together and secure a positive, ambitious, balanced, negotiated outcome in Glasgow next year, with all voices heard in the process. Now, as COP26 presidency, we will use the findings from this report. Thank you again for all the hard work, for the evidence that underpins this. And we will also use the upcoming Adaptation Gap report to continue to champion the need for the highest possible ambition that the world has to offer across all pillars of the Paris Agreement. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Young. And thanks to all the panelists and Anne, of course, for your presentation. I'd like to move straight away to the Q&A portion. We don't have that much time left. The first question we have is one, I think, is for Mr. Young and Mr. Samad. The question is from Chloe Farrand at Climate Home News. Ahead of the Ambition Summit on Saturday, could you give us an idea of how many countries that wanted to speak have been denied a slot because their pledges were not bold enough? Are Russia and Brazil likely to make the cut? So that's over to you, Mr. Young and Mr. Samad. I'm not sure who would like to start.
I'm happy. Sorry?
Go first, please.
Okay, happy either way. Thank you, Chloe. And it's a good question, but I'm afraid I don't want to spoil the suspense for Saturday. You will have to wait and see which countries will be announcing their commitments. What I would say is that we have been collectively, alongside the co-hosts, we have sought to focus on ambition, and we have sought to use the summit as a platform to encourage further ambition. I won't go into all the difficult and detailed conversations that we've had with various countries, but what I would say is that we really want this summit to focus on what countries are doing and focusing on the positive rather than focusing on who might not be present, because I think it's a huge opportunity for the world to come forward and see that actually countries from across the spectrum are committing to further ambition across mitigation, adaptation, and support. And it's important that we create that platform so that the world can see that. Thank you.
Side, what I can say is that the summit, we're very much supporting the UK presidency in this summit, and what we are encouraging everyone in is that their participation should be based on highly ambitious actions. And business as usual is no longer, as we have seen, and this GAP report also makes it very, very clear, is not something that we ought to encourage.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on to our next question, which is for Ms. Anderson and Mr. Young. It's from Urmi Goswami from India's Economic Times. The question is, the net zero announcements are encouraging, but the short and medium term goals do not reflect the urgency of action. Besides the cost of delayed action, it could make the transition for low and middle income countries more difficult, as these countries need to grow. How can global attention and effort and the COP26 presidency ensure focus on distributional and equity aspects of the transition? Let me know if you'd like me to repeat any part of it.
Start out here and just say simply, yes, Mr. Goswami, what we need to see and what the numbers bear out is that the G20 bears 78% of emissions. So the G20 has a responsibility to lean in. And we're pleased to have seen the net zero commitments from a number of G20 countries, but we need to see them all. And then we need to see these countries actually, as we heard from Petteri, put this into action. And that's where we are at this point. But the good news is 126 countries, including small island states, many developing countries, have made the net zero commitment. there, your point on solidarity becomes absolutely key, because there are countries that still only have, 20, 30, 40% energy access. And these countries need to be able to deal with energy production. And that energy production, we don't want that to have to go through a polluting age. So solidarity, contribution into the Green Climate Fund, solidarity and investments from the IFIs, etc., and the kind of solidarity that we can see and the smart move for the future that we can see will become important. And finally, maybe just to say that as we now have the net zero commitments, including from South Africa, which is a significant economy that has made that net zero commitment and hasn't been mentioned, so I thought I would be sure to mention it. Just to say that as these net zero commitments have been made, the promissory notes that this gets translated into is called the NDC. And that is now what needs to happen. We hope very much that, and Mr. Young will reveal in due time what will transpire on Saturday, but we wish to see those commitments that have been made by heads of state getting into technocratic detail about how this will be delivered over the coming 3 decades, because these declarations of net zero need to then be translated into actual actions on the ground. And finally, the stimulus packages that most countries are rolling out is an opportunity. I would say we kind of missed the first wave on the stimulus packages. They did not hit as much as they should on the green recovery. Obviously, health and social protection goes outside and needs to be the priority. But the stimulus packages now, these stimulus packages being discussed in parliaments across the world absolutely must contain all the elements to ensure that we can make that gear shifts and decarbonize our economies. Thank you.
If I can add to that, and I think that's been a very comprehensive answer, but first of all, I'd just point to the fact, yes, you're right in terms of the question posing the risk of a focus on long term as opposed to short term. But actually, one of the things that we found in the UK is the value of that long-term ambition in really driving short-term action. If I reflect on the difference of the conversation in the UK from when we had an 80% reduction by 2050 target to when we had a net zero 2050 target. With an 80% reduction target, there were many who thought that actually they were part of the 20%. They didn't need to change. Actually, when you move to net zero, everybody is in. Everybody needs to look at their plans. There are no hiding places. So I think that long-term action can drive the short-term action. That said, you're absolutely right that there is a need for solidarity and there is a need for developed countries to be taking the lead, as is articulated in many places of the Paris Agreement and the Convention. Through our plans for COP26, we are absolutely putting pressure across all countries, but not just pressure, but really looking to see how we can support and help countries identify the actions that are most appropriate for them, but also, like I said, in terms of the campaigns that we're working, looking at where there are opportunities in sectors on energy transition, on zero emission vehicles, on nature-based solutions, on adaptation and resilience, and on support, where there are opportunities to really accelerate the transformation that is required. Because increasingly, we need to move away from this notion that actually climate action is a trade-off from development, and actually look at how there are really clear synergies and promote action across all of the SDGs and show that solidarity with countries to help them achieve those goals. And as Inger Andersen set out, actually many of the commitments that we've seen coming forward this year, many of the most ambitious, are coming forward from some of the smallest and some of the most vulnerable. This is collective action. Yes, there are some areas and elements which certain countries can go further and faster on, but actually what's really encouraging is that sense of everybody being in a collective effort to achieve the Paris Agreement's goals.
Thank you very much. We have one last question, if you will allow me. It is from Casey Culleney from Cosmetics Design Europe, who asks, given how important household contributions are to overall emissions, how important will citizen education be in closing the gap? And will this be for government, for industry, for brands? If possible, maybe Mr. Sarmad and Ms. Anderson could respond.
And thank you for that question. I'll be very brief. Again, a good question, interesting. And at the outset, Paris Agreement Article 12 is very clear about the need for education, training, and ensuring everyone is engaged in those outreach activities. And through that, we have something referred to Action for Climate Empowerment through very dedicated training on all aspects. So it's, well, whether it is for governments, industry, or brands, actually, it is for everyone. And one of our UN partner agencies, UNITAR, offers some very dedicated and very good training courses, which are free online as a public good. And all of that needs to be also in the industries need to be incorporated as a moral and ethical responsibility to disclose, to transparently show that that industry and those companies are ensuring that they are in compliance with the Paris Agreement goals and not contributing to those emissions. And many other industries are actually already doing that. Finance industry is one of those. So we hope the cosmetics and the brands that you represent can take that on and do that. And obviously the governments are certainly listening to this, and they will be doing what they need to do in establishing the relevant policies. Inger, over to you.
Thank you. I think you've done a very thorough job. I'll just say that the report this year bears out that, that 2/3 of global emissions are linked to private households. So what we do or don't do at home and how we live matters. The 1%, and we heard the numbers from Anne, 1% means people who live on more than global 1%, more than $109,000 a year. So that's a broad swath. So each one of us, if we take the 10%, that's $38,000 a year. Those folks have a job to do in thinking about not the punitive, but the kind of life choices we make. How many square feet do we need in our homes? And kids are good at holding us to account. And I do think that the next wave of consumers are much more aware than the past wave, if you like, and they're making wiser choices. And so I do believe that all the issues that Owais mentioned, but also this broader awareness needs to be raised, and the media has a huge job in helping us do just that, as well as obviously the UN system doing our bit with the different pieces that we bring to the table. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson and Mr. Samad. Now, one final question for Professor Talas. What does WMO see, given that the emissions gap is not closing? What do you expect from the upcoming Climate Ambition Summit and COP26 to put us on track to meet the Paris goals?
Yeah, as I said in my opening statement, we are not on track to reach the Paris agreements, and we are more on track to reach 3 to 5 degrees by the end of this century. And if we are not able to stop using the fossil sources of energy, we could reach 8 degrees by the end of next century. I have been following this climate issue since the 80s when I started my meteorology studies, and I think that there's reason to be fairly optimistic at the moment. We have seen these groups of countries committing to this carbon neutrality target, and we have growing amount of private sector actors, big companies, and also finance sector is very active nowadays in investing in climate-friendly technologies. So I'm personally very optimistic. Besides that, we have to invest in climate adaptation. This negative trend in climate will anyhow continue until 2060s, and we will see growing amount of disasters and negative impacts of climate change, and adaptation is also very important. And we are grateful for the UK government that you have been promoting REAP initiative, and that's the other side of the coin. But there's a reason to be optimistic, but what I said in my opening statement, the concrete action finally matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So that brings us to the end of today's program. I'd like to end by thanking our panelists very much for their informative presentations and remarks, and our media colleagues for joining us for this launch. I know it's the end of the year and everybody's pretty much over 2020, so we're thankful for your time and attention. If you have questions, we remain available for interviews and to answer any queries you may have on the report. In the meantime, thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye-bye.